The year is 1803, and the United States just doubled in size overnight. Nobody planned for it. Thomas Jefferson had sent 2 men to Paris to buy the city of New Orleans. Just the city. They came back with 828,000 square miles. Most of that land was a complete mystery. And had walked it, and almost no one alive could tell you what was out there. That uncertainty didn't stop people. It pulled them forward. See, there is something about the human mind that hears the word unknown and leans in instead of backing away. And in the early 1800s, that instinct was about to place on a map. It was an idea. It was the belief, stubborn, almost irrational, that something better was waiting just past the next ridge. Farmers in Virginia who couldn't pay their debts heard about cheap land in Kentucky and Tennessee. They loaded everything they owned onto a wagon. They crossed the Appalachian Mountains through a gap in the rock called Cumberland Gap. Daniel Boone had carved a path through that gap in 1770. It was barely wide enough for a cart, carved through dense old-growth forest. People still died crossing it, but they kept coming. By 1800, more than 220,000 people had crossed through Cumberland Gap alone. Think about that number. 220,000 people. Land they had never seen, for a chance they couldn't guarantee. That is how desperate and how bold the pull of the frontier really was. And it wasn't just the poor. Educated men, lawyers, doctors, soldiers, they all felt it. Because the frontier offered something money alone couldn't buy. A clean start. No old debts, no old names. Out there, past the last town, past the last fence post, you were whoever you said you were. That promise was intoxicating. Now, the land itself, it didn't make promises gently. The frontier was violent, unpredictable, and enormous in ways that are hard to grasp today. The Ohio River Valley was thick with black bear, timber wolves, and cottonmouth snakes. The Great Plains beyond that were flat and treeless and stretched so far that early travelers said it felt like drowning in sky. Spring floods could wipe out a homestead in an hour. A drought could starve an entire settlement over a summer. And this land was not empty. It had never been empty. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Osage, the Comanche, had lived on this land for generations. They had trade routes, governance, agriculture, memory built into every valley and river bend. The story of the American frontier cannot be told honestly without saying that plainly. What American settlers called open land was land someone else already called home. That tension between the hunger of settlers and the rights of the people already there would define the next 100 years. But in the early 1800s, most of the men and women packing their wagons weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about soil, about timber, about starting over. In 1804, Jefferson sent 2 men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, into that unknown territory with orders to find out exactly what America had just bought. They would travel more than 8,000 miles. They would encounter 71 Native American tribes, and the journals they brought back would do something no government document ever could. They would make the West feel real. They would give it names and distances and beauty that ordinary people could imagine. Going to keep them away. What those journals revealed and what it would cost to act on them, that is where we go next. The year was 1803. And America had just doubled in size overnight. Nobody alive had ever seen what lay beyond the Mississippi River. Not really. Not on foot. Not with their own eyes. Thomas Jefferson, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark. Lewis was 30 years old, precise and fearless to the point of recklessness. Clark was steadier, warmer, a natural leader of men who would follow him into darkness. Jefferson gave them one order: go west and come back alive. On May 14, 1804, the expedition shoved off from Camp Dubois, Illinois. Salt pork to last a year. The Missouri River was nothing like they expected. It pushed back, hard. Snags ripped holes in the hull. The current ran so fast that some days they made only a few miles. They pulled, they rowed, they dragged the boat by hand through the shallows. And that was just the first week. By August, no American had officially mapped. The plains stretched in every direction, flat and golden and endless. Lewis wrote in his journal that the silence was almost frightening. Then the Teton Sioux stopped them. 3 chiefs rode to the riverbank and demanded tribute. One of the pirogues fully loaded. Lewis refused. Men on both sides reached for weapons. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then one chief lowered his hand, and the expedition moved on, shaken, but alive. Winter hit them in what is now North Dakota, and it hit without mercy. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. 3 men had fingers blackened by frostbite. They built a fort and called it Fort Mandan, and they huddled inside and waited. It was there they met her, a 16-year-old Shoshone woman, pregnant, married to a French trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. Her name was Sacagawea, and she would become the most valuable member of the entire expedition, not because she guided them through mountains, that myth came later, but because her presence changed everything about how the tribes they met saw them. A war party does not travel with a woman and a baby. Every tribe they passed read that signal and stepped back. She was not a guide, she was proof of peace. In the spring of 1805, they pushed west again, deeper now, into country no American had ever touched. They crossed into what is now Montana, and the land changed beneath their feet. The Missouri narrowed, the banks rose into cliffs of pale limestone. Lewis wrote that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then the mountains appeared on the horizon, the Rockies. They had known the mountains were there, roughly, from Indian accounts. They had not known they would rise this high, or stretch this wide, or look this impossible to cross. Clark climbed a ridge and stared west, and saw nothing but more mountains. Range after range, for as far as he could see. He did not write anything that night. Some things are too large for words, but they had come too far to turn back. They would cross. This thing any of them had ever survived. The frontier was never just land, it was a tool, and the men in power knew exactly how to use it. By the 1820s, the United States government had a problem. There were thousands of Native American tribes still living on land that white settlers wanted. Negotiation had failed. Warfare was expensive. So President Andrew Jackson came up with something else. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. 5 words that destroyed a world. The law gave the federal government power to relocate entire nations by force if necessary. It didn't call it removal by force. It called it voluntary exchange. But here's what that actually looked like. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, 5 nations, tens of thousands of people, were told to leave their homes. Homes their families had lived in for generations. Some of them had built churches, schools, newspapers in their own written language. Sequoyah had invented a writing system, the Cherokee syllabary, just 12 years earlier. These were not people living in the Stone Age. They were farmers, lawyers, some of them slave owners themselves, living inside a functioning society. None of it mattered. In 1838, the U.S. Army rounded up roughly 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children at gunpoint. They were held in stockades through a brutal summer heat. Thousands died of disease before the march even began. Then, in the dead of winter, they were forced to walk over 800 miles through ice and mud and starvation. A Cherokee woman named Rebecca Nugent was just 3 years old when it happened. She survived and later remembered watching people drop dead in the road beside her. By the time they reached what is now Oklahoma, somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee had died. The Cherokee called it Nana Dowt Suni, the trail where they cried. We call it the Trail of Tears. But here's the part that gets buried in textbooks. This wasn't chaos. This was policy. The frontier was being cleared deliberately to make room for cotton plantations, slave labor, and westward expansion. The land the Cherokee were removed from in Georgia, gold had just been discovered there. In 1829, 1 year before the Removal Act was signed. That is not a coincidence. While the 5 nations were being pushed west, a different kind of frontier weapon was being tested in Texas. Mexico had invited American settlers in, hoping they would stabilize the region. Stephen F. Austin brought the first 300 American families into Texas in 1821. Within 10 years, Americans in Texas outnumbered Mexicans 3-1. The Mexican government started to panic. They banned further American immigration and tried to enforce their laws. The settlers ignored them. Tensions boiled. In 1835, it exploded. The Texas Revolution began, and at its center was a question the whole country was watching. Could settlers use the frontier itself as justification for seizing someone else's country? On March 2, 1836, Texas declared independence. 5 weeks later, Sam Houston's outnumbered army crushed the Mexican forces at the Battle of San Jacinto in just 18 minutes. 18 minutes. That battle handed the United States a template. Move settlers in, let the conflict build, then ride in as the hero. The frontier wasn't just being crossed anymore. It was being weaponized. Strategically, and with the full backing of the United States government. And the men who figured out how to use it best were about to aim it at an entire continent. By 1840, the word trail meant something different in America. It didn't mean a path through the woods anymore. It meant a gamble. It meant loading everything you owned into a wooden wagon and pointing it west. It meant leaving behind graves you'd never visit again. The Oregon Trail alone stretched over 2,000 miles. 2,000 miles of desert, river crossing, and mountain pass, and people chose it. Thousands of them. The first major wagon train left Independence, Missouri in May of 1843. Around 1,000 people, nearly 5,000 cattle. They called it the Great Migration. John Gant, a former Army captain, led them out of Missouri. He knew the land better than almost anyone alive at that point. But knowing the land and surviving it were two very different. Came at the Platte River in present-day Nebraska. The water was wide but shallow. About an inch of water over a mile of quicksand. Wagons got stuck. Livestock drowned anyway. And they were barely 3 weeks in. Here's what people don't understand about these trails. It wasn't just the distance that killed you. It was the accumulation. Every river crossing weakened the wagon axles. Every mountain pass cost the oxen something they couldn't get back. And every grave marker along the trail, and there were thousands of them, told the story of someone who ran out of something: water, food, time, luck. The most dangerous stretch was the Blue Mountains in present-day Oregon. By the time settlers reached them, it was late October. The passes were already closing. A wagon train that left even 2 weeks too late could be tracked. Which is exactly what happened to the Donner Party in 1846. But we'll come back to them. Because on the Oregon Trail, the Donner Party was the one that made the newspapers. Meanwhile, a different trail was cutting through a different kind of danger. The Santa Fe Trail ran nearly 900 miles southwest from Missouri into Mexican territory. It was a trade route, not a settler's path. Merchants carried cotton, hardware, silk, goods the Southwest desperately wanted, and they came back loaded with silver and mules. But the Comanche controlled the southern plains along that route. They had for over a century, and they had no intention of giving that up for free. Raids on Santa Fe Trail caravans were not random. They were strategic. The Comanche understood leverage, and a wagon full of goods crossing their land was leverage. American merchants hired armed escorts. Sometimes the army sent troops. By 1848, roughly $15 million in goods moved along that trail every single year. And every single year, some of it never arrived. Then gold changed everything. When James Marshall found flakes of gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848, the trails didn't just get busier, they got desperate. Men left farms half-planted, families half-fed. Some of them didn't even own a wagon. They walked. The California Trail split off from the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall in present-day Idaho. From there, it cut through the Nevada desert in August heat. Temperatures hit over 100 degrees for weeks straight. Oxen died mid-stride. People left furniture, pianos, cast iron stoves along the trail to lighten the load. You can still find the ruts today, carved 3 inches deep into solid rock. 3 inches into rock. That's how many wagons passed over the same spot. That's what desperation looks like when it's moving at 2 miles an hour. But the trails didn't just carry settlers. Cholera spread along the Platte River route like fire through dry grass. In 1850 alone, it killed an estimated 10,000 trail travelers, 10,000 people in a single year. Most of them never saw a doctor. Most of them were buried the same afternoon they died. Their families kept moving because stopping meant dying too. The trails were reshaping the continent in real time, and the people already living on that land, the Pawnee, the Shoshone, the Sioux, watched it happen and understood exactly what it meant. It meant the frontier they'd known was ending, and what replaced it would be something none of them, settler or native, had ever seen before. January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall spotted something glinting in the water at Sutter's Mill, California. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and felt his stomach drop. It was gold. He told his boss, John Sutter, and they both agreed to keep it quiet. That lasted about 3 weeks. By spring, the secret was out, and nothing on the American frontier would ever be the same. Word traveled fast, but it didn't travel alone. It traveled with rumor, with exaggeration, with the specific kind of madness that only money can produce. Men who had never held a pickaxe bought one. Men who had wives, farms, debts, they left all of it behind. By 1849, over 80,000 people had flooded into California from every direction. They came by ship around Cape Horn, a journey of 5 brutal months. They came overland on the California Trail, through desert and over mountain passes. Some came through Panama, cutting across the jungle to shave off time. They came from the eastern states, from Mexico, from Chile, from China, from Australia. San Francisco went from a quiet port town of about 1,000 people to a roaring city of 25,000 almost overnight. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the gold rush. Most of the miners made almost nothing. The men who got rich were the ones selling shovels, boots, canvas tents, and biscuits. A man named Samuel Brannan figured that out early. He bought up every pan and pickaxe in San Francisco, then ran through the streets shouting about the gold strike. Within weeks he had made a fortune, not from mining but from selling miners their dreams. But gold wasn't the only thing drawing men west. The frontier had always run on a particular kind of currency, violence. Where law was thin, men made their own, and some of those men became legends. Take a man like Wild Bill Hickok. Born James Butler Hickok in Illinois in 1837, he drifted west as a young man looking for work. He became a scout, a lawman, a gambler, and one of the most feared gunfighters on the Great Plains. His eyes, people said, could spot trouble before trouble knew it was trouble. In 1871, he was hired as marshal of Abilene, Kansas, a cattle town that had gotten completely out of hand. Abilene was the end of the Chisholm Trail, which meant it was where cowboys arrived after months on the road, thirsty, paid, and looking for a fight. Hickok wore 2 pearl-handled revolvers, butts facing forward, cross-draw style. He kept his back to the wall in every saloon he entered. He lasted 8 months in Abilene before the town fired him. He was, they said, too dangerous even for the job. Men like Hickok existed at the edge of something. They were the product of a frontier that demanded toughness, but had no plan for what to do with tough men once the work was done. The same was true of the mining camps. Men arrived with enormous hope and left. Camps became their own small civilizations, with their own rules, their own judges, their own punishments. Theft in a camp could get a man flogged or hanged before noon. There was no sheriff to call, no courthouse to appeal to. You settled things yourself, or you didn't settle them at all. And through all of it, the gold, the guns, the chaos, the frontier kept moving. It moved because that was what frontiers do. Every settlement that got too civilized just pushed the wild part for someone else. That detail, the one most people preferred not to say out loud, was about to become impossible to ignore. But while men were striking it rich and shooting each other over gold claims, something far darker was happening just out of sight. The frontier wasn't empty land waiting to be filled. It was home to hundreds of thousands of people who had lived there for generations. And the U.S. government had a plan for what to do about that. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a war of erasure, fought across decades in places most Americans have never heard of. Most of the country was watching the Civil War. But in the Colorado Territory, something was unfolding that would haunt the nation for a century. A Cheyenne village sat along Sand Creek, peaceful, flying a U.S. flag above their chief's tent. Chief Black Kettle had been told by U.S. officers that his people were under the Army's protection. He believed them. On the morning of November 29th, Colonel John Chivington rode in with 700 soldiers. He gave no warning. By the end of that day, somewhere between 150 and 500 Cheyenne and Arapaho people were dead, mostly women, children, and elders. It became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. And here's the thing. Chivington wasn't court-martialed. He resigned, and then he gave lectures about it. That tells you something about the world the frontier was built on. But the wars kept going. The Red River War of 1874. That's one most people skip right past in textbooks. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the same man who burned Atlanta, turned his attention to the southern plains. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Southern Cheyenne, they had resisted confinement to reservations for years. They weren't wrong to resist. The reservations were deliberately underfunded. The promised food and supplies were stolen or never delivered. So when warriors raided settlements in Texas and Kansas, they weren't acting randomly. They were fighting for survival. Sherman's response was to send Colonel Ranald Mackenzie into the Texas Panhandle with orders to end it. On September 28, 1874, Mackenzie's forces found the main Comanche encampment, hidden inside Palo Duro Canyon. The canyon walls were 800 feet high. The Comanche had used it as a at dawn. Few people died in the actual fighting, but Mackenzie did something more devastating than killing. He burned everything. The tippies, the food stores, the winter supplies, all of it gone. Then he shot over 1,000 horses. Without horses, the Comanche couldn't hunt. By spring of 1875, the last free bands of Comanche and Kiowa had surrendered. The southern plains were open for settlement. Further north, it was the same story playing out in different terrain. The Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred to the Lakota Sioux. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the hills. His official job was to scout for a fort location. His unofficial discovery changed everything. Gold. Within a year, thousands of miners had poured into land that was legally protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The U.S. government told the Lakota to sell the hills. The Lakota said no, and so the government stopped pretending the treaty existed. What came next was the Great Sioux War of 1876, and at its center, one of the most famous battles in American history. A battle that didn't go the way the Army expected, not even close. And that defeat, brief, bloody, and humiliating, would unleash a fury that sealed the fate of the Plains tribes forever. Here's the thing about the Wild West. Most of it never happened. What you've seen in movies is a fantasy, polished and sold back to you. The real frontier towns were messy, complicated. Take Dodge City, Kansas. In 1872, it was nothing but a cluster of tents and wooden shacks near a railroad stop. Buffalo hunters dragged their hides in, drank whatever was available, and caused chaos. The smell alone, rotting hides, cattle, and open sewage, would have knocked you flat. And the violence? Dodge City recorded roughly 15 murders in its bloodiest year compared to modern American cities of the same size. The myth was always bigger than the reality. But here's where it gets interesting. Someone was deliberately building that myth in real time. Dime novels, cheap lurid paperbacks, were selling millions of copies back east. Writers who had never set foot west of New Jersey were describing epic shootouts and savage lawlessness. And readers ate it up because they wanted the frontier to be dangerous and romantic. The frontier became a mirror, showing Americans the version of themselves they wanted to believe in. Now let's talk about the lawmen, because they were nothing like the statues built later. Wyatt Earp, for example, spent years working both sides of the law. Before he ever pinned a badge in Tombstone, Arizona, he had been arrested for horse theft in 1871. He gambled, he ran gambling operations, and he had a very flexible relationship with legal authority. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881, it lasted approximately 30 seconds. 3 men died, and it happened in a narrow lot beside a photography studio, not on some dramatic open street. But within weeks, Newspaper editors across the country had already turned it into legend. That is how fast the myth machine worked. Pat Garrett, the man who shot Billy the Kid in 1881, spent the rest of his life struggling to profit from the moment. Billy the Kid himself, real name Will and Bonnie, possibly Henry McCarty, was 21 years old when he died. He had killed maybe 8 men, not the 21 the legend claimed. But 21 was a better number for a dime novel. The towns themselves were lawless in a very specific economic way. They existed because of one industry: cattle, silver, buffalo, gold, and they died when that industry moved on. Tombstone's silver mines flooded in 1886. Within 5 years, the population collapsed from 10,000 people to under 1,000. Deadwood, South Dakota, famous for its gold rush chaos, incorporated legally and cleaned itself up by the 1880s. Wild Bill Hickok was shot dead there in 1876, holding a poker hand. Legend almost immediately. What these towns shared was impermanence. They burned fast, flooded, collapsed, or simply emptied when the money vanished, and yet the mythology they generated has never stopped. By the 1880s, Buffalo Bill Cody was already touring his Wild West show across the country. He hired real cowboys, real native warriors, and real sharpshooters like Annie Oakley, and he sold audiences back east a version of the frontier that was already disappearing. The frontier was being mourned and monetized at the Jackson Turner declared the frontier officially closed in 1893. He said it had shaped the American character, the independence, the suspicion of authority. Whether he was right is still debated, but what is not debated is this: the stories outlasted the reality by over a century. You are still living in the shadow of towns that lasted maybe 15 years, and the men who shaped those towns, complicated, violent, often criminal, became saints in leather boots. What Americans built on the frontier was not just a nation pushing westward. They built a story about themselves that they could not let go of. And just when that story seemed settled, the frontier produced something nobody expected. By 1880, the open land was dying, and almost nobody wanted to admit it. The great buffalo herds that had once darkened the Great Plains for miles were nearly gone. In 1870, there were still an estimated 30 million bison roaming free. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. That number, 1,000, is not of life built around them collapsed. The Plains tribes had been fighting this moment for decades. Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota had already won one war against the U.S. government, the only native leader in American history to do so. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie promised the Black Hills to the Lakota forever. Forever lasted 6 years. In 1874, George Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and came back with one word: gold. That single word erased a federal treaty. Thousands of prospectors flooded in before the government even pretended to stop them. The Lakota and Cheyenne refused to leave land that was legally, on paper, theirs. Sitting Bull, medicine man, war chief, visionary, called a massive gathering in the summer of 1876. Warriors came from across the northern plains: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. By June, the village along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Custer rode toward it thinking he had the upper hand. He did not. On June 25, 1876, Custer divided his regiment and charged with 210 men into a camp of several thousand. Within an hour, Custer and every man under his direct command were dead. The nation was shocked, but not in the way the Lakota might have hoped. The army didn't pull back. It came back harder, and this time it didn't stop. By the spring of 1877, Crazy Horse, the war leader who had planned the Little Bighorn attack, surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. He was killed in custody that September, a bayonet through his back, under disputed circumstances that have never been fully resolved. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, and the open land kept shrinking, because while the wars were happening, something quieter was happening too. Farmers were arriving by the tens of thousands under the Homestead Act of 1862. 160 acres, free if you could work it for 5 years. They came from everywhere: Illinois, Germany, Sweden, Norway. They planted wheat in soil that had never been broken. They built homes out of sod because there were no trees. They strung barbed wire, invented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden of Illinois, and fenced off land that cattlemen and tribes had roamed freely. That wire changed everything faster than any gun. The open-range cattle drives that had defined the post-Civil War West began to collapse. By the late 1880s, the long drives up the Chisholm Trail were finished. Ranchers were fencing in their own land now, and the cowboys' world was disappearing. In 1887, a catastrophic winter, historians call it the Big Die-Up, killed millions of cattle across the northern plains in a single season. Some ranchers lost everything. The era of the open range had lasted barely 20 years. And then came the final blow. Quiet, bureaucratic, and devastating. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau made a simple announcement. There was no longer a definable frontier line in America. For the first time since Europeans set foot on this continent, the land had been mapped, divided, and claimed. The frontier, the idea that you could always go further west and start over, was officially closed. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner read that census report and wrote a famous essay arguing that the frontier had been the defining force of American democracy itself. Take away the frontier, he said, and you take away something essential about who Americans are. Whether he was right is a debate historians still haven't settled, but the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the last of the open-range cowboys, they didn't need an essay to know something irreplaceable was gone. They had watched it disappear in real time. By the winter of 1890, a new movement was sweeping through the reservations, a spiritual, desperate hope called the Ghost Dance. Army Did Next would become one of the darkest moments in American history. And then, just like that, it was over. Not with a battle, not with a treaty, not even with a single gunshot. It ended with a sentence, 12 words buried in a government report. The year was 1890. The Census Bureau had spent months tallying the population of the United States, and when they finished, they wrote something that stopped historians cold. There can hardly be said to be a frontier line. 12 words. The frontier, the line that had defined America for 250 years, was officially gone. Just erased from the record, and the country had no idea what to do next. Here's what people forget. The frontier wasn't just land, it was an idea. Always go west. Lost your farm? Go west. Ran from the law? Go west. Wanted to start over? Go west. That option, that escape valve, had existed since the first colonists pushed into the wilderness, and in 1890, it closed forever. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner understood exactly what that meant. He was 29 years old, teaching at the University of Wisconsin, and in 1893, he stood up at a conference in Chicago and delivered a paper that changed American thinking entirely. He called it The Significance of the Frontier in American History. His argument was simple and terrifying. The frontier, Turner said, was the engine of American democracy. It created self-reliance, it created toughness, it created the American character, that restless, stubborn, never-quit spirit. And now the engine was dead. The room went quiet, because everyone in that room knew he was right. Out west, the signs were already everywhere. The great buffalo herds, 60 million animals that once shook the ground, had been reduced to fewer than 1,000. The open-range cattle drives that made cowboys legendary were finished. Barbed wire had carved the land into locked squares. The last major tribes had been confined to reservations, their world shattered and shrinking. Even the wildest men of the frontier era sensed the end coming. Wyatt Earp, the lawman who had tamed Tombstone, was living quietly in California, doing odd jobs, nearly broke. Jesse James was already 10 years in the grave. Billy the Kid had been dead for nearly a decade. The characters of the frontier were dying off, one by one like candles going out, and the land itself was changing faster than anyone could stop. Towns that had been raw dirt camps in the 1860s were now cities with electric lights. Railroads that stitched the continent together so tightly that the West barely meant anything anymore. There was no more beyond, no more over the next ridge. The map was full. And for the first time in its history, America had to sit still and figure out who it actually was. That question would haunt the country for decades. Some men turned it into nostalgia. Buffalo Bill Cody built a traveling circus around it. selling the myth of a West that was already dead. Others turned it into ambition. If there was no more frontier at home, they would find one abroad. Within 8 years, the United States would be at war in Cuba and the Philippines, reaching for an empire. The restless energy of the frontier had to go somewhere. It always does. But even as the country pushed outward, something quieter was happening back home. People were writing down their memories. Old cowboys, old homesteaders, old soldiers. They knew they had lived through something enormous, and they knew it would never come again. The American frontier was more than a place. It was the first chapter of something that may never be finished. But the story of what came after, what America built from the ashes of that lost world, that is something else entirely. And then, suddenly it was over. Not with a battle, not with a treaty, just a line in a census report. In 1890, the Census Bureau made a quiet announcement that would echo for generations. They said, for the first time in American history, there was no longer a continuous line of unsettled land. The frontier was closed, and most Americans barely noticed. But one man did. His name was Frederick Jackson Turner, a young historian from Wisconsin. In 1893, he stood up at a conference in Chicago and said something that stunned the room. He said the frontier was not just land. It was the engine of everything America believed about itself. Freedom, reinvention, the idea that if life broke you, you could always move west and start again. And now that was gone. Think about what that meant for ordinary people. For 200 years, restless men and women had a release valve, a place to disappear to, a place to become someone new. That valve was now shut. The pressure had nowhere to go. Cities swelled, factories choked. Had defined the American character, began quietly to crack. But the loss went deeper than that, because closing the frontier did not just change what Americans could do, it changed what they remembered. The West had already become a myth before the last acre was settled. Buffalo Bill Cody had been selling it since the 1880s. His Wild West show toured the world. Antiochian crowds. Sitting Bull sat in the arena and stared at the audience and said nothing. The real West, brutal, dirty, heartbreaking, was already being replaced by a cleaner story, a story of heroes and outlaws, of wide-open skies and righteous gunfights. The messy truth was getting edited out. The disease that wiped out village after village, the broken promises in treaty after treaty, the women who lost children on the trail and kept walking anyway, the Chinese laborers who built the railroads and were then told to leave. These stories were not in Buffalo Bill's show. They were not in the dime novels. They were not in the paintings hanging in eastern galleries showing noble cowboys against purple mountains. And so when the frontier closed, what the country chose to mourn was the myth, not the reality. At the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the reality was already catastrophic. The Lakota people had been confined to land that could barely support life. Rations had been cut. A ghost dance movement had spread, a desperate spiritual belief that the old world could return. The U.S. Army was terrified of it, and in December 1890, the same year the frontier was declared closed, soldiers opened fire on a Lakota encampment at Wounded Knee Creek. At least 250 men, women, and children were killed. Some say more. It was the last large-scale massacre of Native Americans by U.S. forces on American soil. The frontier did not close quietly after all. It closed in blood and snow. And the country looked away, because the myth was easier to carry than the truth. We tell ourselves we inherited a nation built by courage and vision. And we did, but we also inherited the silence around what that cost. The frontier shaped everything, our optimism, our restlessness, our belief that tomorrow can always be bigger than today. But it was built on ground that already belonged to someone else, and somewhere between the legend and the ledger, the full truth still waits to be reckoned with.